All right, class. Module 9 is titled Rise of the Middle Class. This is going to be mostly um, economics and kind of sociology of what's going on in the country after the close of World War II. And so, first thing the text points out is it's the only major industrialized nation not devastated by the war. The United States had an unprecedented global position. And here's a statistic to give you an example of this. For about 10 years after the war, the United States accounted for approximately half of the entire global economy. Now, today, by contrast, that number is about 25%. So we are still the single most dominant country economically by far. But still, it's our share of the global economy has been cut in half over the last 75 years from 50 down to 25%. And the reason for that, the reason why it was so high back then and why it's relatively lower now, although it's still very high, is that the other industrialized nations during this period largely looked like what you see in the photograph here. This is a photograph from Germany. Germany was an industrialized nation until, as we covered in a previous unit, World War II, during which the United States Air Forces reduced major cities and therefore factories in Germany into piles of rubble. And the same thing happened to Japan, as we've covered. So the other industrialized economies, Japan, Germany were major ones, were physically destroyed. They were wrecked. Their factories were piles of rubble. Whereas our factories, we had a great advantage during World War II. And we've always had this advantage relative to other countries. Our factories were not bombed. They were untouched. And so at the end of the war, we had this dominant economic position. The text points out that the federal government's uh, spending on military and domestic programs gave a huge boost to the economy. Now, this is in the eye of the beholder. More conservative economists would argue that spending tax dollars does not help the economy. It actually drives up debt and inflation. And you can make that argument, but more liberal economists would say the opposite, that no, um, sometimes government spending, taxpayer spending, helps the economy. And during this period in the 1950s, let's say, two things were true at once. Number one, our economy was booming. It was in great shape. And number two, our federal government was spending unprecedented amounts of tax dollars. Both of those things were true at the same time. Now, the question, and it's subjective, it's in the eye of the beholder. The question is, just because two things are true at the same time, does that mean that one caused the other? In this context, was our economy doing great because the government was spending huge amounts of tax dollars on military and domestic programs? Was that causation? Government spending led to a great economy? Or is it just coincidence? The economy was great and the government happened to be spending tons of money, but those two things are not related. Is it causation or is it coincidence? So a lot of things in life, you'll have to go through that process in your own mind. Just because two things are true at the same time does not necessarily mean that one caused the other. So it's in the eye of the beholder. As permanent mobilization took place, science, industry, government, all of these different parts of our society became intertwined in a way that really they hadn't before. And if you remember in the last unit, we talked briefly about Eisenhower talking about what he called the military-industrial complex. So you could say this is an example of that, both in military programs and also more peaceful scientific industrial programs like the space race. Cold War competition for military supremacy spawned both an arms race. So the Soviet Union and the United States, for example, are in a race to develop bigger and better missiles and nuclear weapons and submarines, things like that, and also the space race. And the space race did have some military um, aspect to it because the space race involves, among other things, huge missiles. You need to develop huge rockets with enormous lift capacity to get satellites and or people into outer space. And those huge rockets, I talked to you briefly last unit, I believe, about Werner von Braun, that German Nazi rocket scientist that developed weapons for Hitler in the form of missiles. And then we brought him over here and he developed rockets for us for peaceful purposes to be able to get to the moon. Now, all of that technology, though, could be used for military applications as well. So there's some crossover between the space race and the arms race. And both involved huge amounts of tax dollars and also big businesses in the United States producing the hardware. In terms of trade policy, during the 1950s, exports nearly doubled, and we had a huge trade surplus. So we haven't talked about this specifically in this course, I don't think, and it's a timely issue. So let's break this down, and I want you to think critically about this issue. When we export things, we're making them here and sending them elsewhere, and we're selling them in other countries. When we import things, we're shipping things into our country that are produced in other countries, and we're buying them here. So we can sell or we can buy. I mean, we do both, of course. And then the question is, how do those things balance out? If we export more than we import, in other words, we sell more than we buy, that is a trade surplus, also known as a positive balance of trade. If we import, so that's what we're doing in the 50s. Now the situation is reversed. Now we import, buy much more than we export, sell, and therefore now we have a huge trade deficit, a negative balance of trade. And I want you to think critically about, is a trade deficit, a negative balance of trade, necessarily a bad thing? So the causes, how do you get a trade surplus? Well, you're very productive, you're selling a lot of stuff in other countries, you are arguing for free trade. We talked earlier in the context of the Depression about free trade versus tariffs or protectionism. So there are different policies you can put in place to make sure you have a trade surplus. But trade deficit, let's linger on that for a couple minutes because I want you to think about your personal life. So let's go down to a micro level, not trillions of dollars and entire nations, but just you and your day-to-day life, because we all have to make these calculations as individuals, trade surplus, trade deficit. So let's take a really simple example from your personal life, all right? You go to Subway and you order a sandwich, you order steak and cheese. You have just incurred a trade deficit with Subway because you bought something from them, you imported something from Subway, but you didn't sell them anything. So after this interaction with Subway, where you buy your steak and cheese, you have a trade deficit of whatever the cost of the sandwich was. Let's say it's $10. You're in the hole $10. You have just incurred a negative balance of trade, a trade deficit, right? Is that a bad decision for you as an individual? Because we have to make these calculations all the time. Here's another way to look at it. If you take the opinion that a trade deficit, negative balance of trade, is automatically a bad thing and must be avoided, all right, let's play that out. That means you don't buy the steak and cheese from Subway. Okay, because maybe you think it's a bad idea. You don't want to be in the hole $10. Okay. That means, therefore, that you need to find another way to get that steak and cheese without incurring a deficit. So the question I would ask you is, how long would it take you to produce a steak and cheese grinder without incurring a trade deficit? Because if you're willing to incur the deficit, you can have your sandwich in 5 minutes. You go into Subway, you give them $10, boom, 5 minutes later, you're out of there, you have your sandwich. If you don't want to do that because you think trade deficits are bad, how would you produce that sandwich on your own? How long would that take you? Is it even possible? So the example I picked was a steak and cheese. Let's start with the steak. Um, do you have a cow? You see where this is going? You probably don't have a cow. If you do have a cow, how did you get the cow? Did you buy the cow? Because if you did, you incurred a trade deficit with the person you bought the cow from. Okay. Let's say you just magically have a cow. Your aunt died and she left you a cow in her will. Okay, congratulations. You have a cow that you didn't incur a deficit for. Do you know how to maintain that cow, feed that cow? By the way, what are you feeding the cow? Where are you getting the food? You incurred a deficit, presumably, to provide the food. But let's say you don't. Let's say you just magically have food on supply for the cow. Okay. Um, how long would it take to fatten up that cow? Do you know how to slaughter a cow? Do you know how to turn that dead cow into delicious, thinly shaved steak? Do you see how this is getting pretty unrealistic for you as an individual to provide yourself something as simple as a steak and cheese grinder all by yourself? What about the cheese? Before you kill the cow and turn it into steak, you need to milk the cow and turn that milk into cheese. Do you know how to do that? And by the way, where's the bread for the sandwich coming from? Do you have a wheat fields in back of your house? And do you know how to grow that wheat and harvest that wheat and thresh it out and turn that grain into a delicious baked grinder roll? Do you know how to do all those things? Do you have the material and the knowledge to do all that stuff? If you do, that's cool, but still, it would take you literally months to produce that steak and cheese sandwich. Months, because wheat takes quite a long time to grow, right? And is that a good use of your time to spend months tending to your cow, tending to your wheat? What are you going to drop out of school, quit your job so that you can be a full-time farmer for 6 months, all in the name of producing a sandwich that you could have gotten in 5 minutes? Do you see how this is incredibly complex? We all make decisions every day in which we incur trade deficits because we calculate, probably without thinking about it, that it's a better use of our time to pay somebody for a good or service and incur a little deficit than it would be to provide everything for ourselves. And you can apply that big picture to our country, right? As individuals, we incur trade deficits all the time. When I go to the gas station and put gas in my car, I'm incurring a trade deficit with the gas station. What's my alternative? Dig a hole in my yard and hope that there's oil there and somehow magically figure out how to refine that oil into gasoline? That's not realistic. We all do this all the time. Now, I want to be clear about one thing before we move on. For your life, in your life, it might make sense for you in any manner of situations to incur a trade deficit with the grocery store, with the gas station, with the clothing store, unless you want to produce all your own food, refine your own gasoline, and make your own clothing. This does not mean that overall you should be spending more money than you're making. Don't do that. It's not good. Piece of free advice. But it does mean that in individual situations, it makes sense to incur deficits with the grocery store, etc. So, in your personal life, where do you have a trade surplus with your employer, right? They give you money. They buy your labor from you. And they're not stupid in doing that. They have decided that they'd rather have your labor than whatever it is they're paying you. Just like you decide you'd rather have a full tank of gas in your car so that you can go to work than the $30 that it takes to fill your tank. So you have a trade surplus with your employer. You take that surplus, you take that money after you've sold your labor, and you go out and incur deficits with the grocery store, with the gas station, etc., but you want to make sure your deficits don't add up to be more than whatever your paycheck was, whatever your surplus was, if that makes sense on a micro level. Now, on a macro level, of course, we're talking billions of dollars and much more complex situations. But just generally speaking in life, whether you're an individual or you're a whole country, you need to make these decisions. Do you want to produce everything by yourself? Or do you want to incur deficits to have other people provide you certain goods and services so that you can free up your time and focus on other things? Really important concept for you to think about. The GI Bill. So this is an example of some of that taxpayer spending that a lot of people argue is very good for the economy. And this is an example that even more conservative types who are not big fans of big social programs, even conservative economists will look at this as an example of something that was a really good investment of tax dollars. Even people that don't like that idea generally, this specific example, they're like, yeah, this actually worked. The GI Bill. So this was for soldiers returning home after World War II. Subsidized college educations and home mortgages for returning veterans. Subsidized, what does that mean? We're using other people's money, taxpayer money, to give to returning soldiers to help them pay for college educations and to help them buy houses. Okay. Is that a wise investment? Well, what do we get out of that in short order? Within probably 10 years of these soldiers coming back, all of a sudden they're being given taxpayer money to go to college. This is before financial aid. Okay. So it was most people cannot afford to go to college. Now all of a sudden it's an option. And what do we get? 500,000 engineers. That's a lot of engineers. That alone probably paid for itself. You give these soldiers other people's taxpayer dollars to do what? To buy something, a college education. A college education usually is one of the very few things that you can buy that will increase in value over time. The other thing that you can buy that will increase in value over time is a house. Almost everything else you spend money on decreases in value over time. A pair of pants does not get more valuable over time. A bowl of chicken soup does not get more valuable over time. A college education does, and a house does, usually, not always, usually. So that's a good investment, right? You give people money to go to college, and then all of a sudden we have a 500,000 engineers. Wow. Electrical engineers, aerospace engineers, civil engineers, mechanical engineers, doing amazing work for our economy, for our infrastructure, for our environment. And by the way, engineers make good money. So what does that mean? That means these 500,000 engineers are paying lots of taxes back into the government from which they got money to go get this education in the first place. So the amount of money that was given to a soldier to become an engineer, in all likelihood, that engineer over the course of his or her career is going to pay way more in taxes than they were given up front to go to college. You see what I'm saying? So that's a great investment for the taxpayers. They get way more money back than they put in. Awesome. 200,000 doctors and nurses. Wow. How many lives did they save? How many new uh, life-saving medical devices and or medicines and pharmaceuticals did they develop? That's a great investment. 150,000 scientists, same thing, right? Those hundreds of thousands of people listed there are a huge help to our economy, our society in general, our infrastructure, our education system. Great investment. Politics aside, great investment. If we spend a tax dollar and then 20 years later we have 20 tax dollars back, that's great. It's a win-win. And then on the housing end, how, buying a house is like buying a college education. It was very difficult back then because there weren't the types of programs that there are now to help people pay for this expensive thing. And so we say to the returning veterans after World War II, number one, we'll give you money to buy a college education. And number two, we'll give you money to help put a down payment so you can buy a house. And that means there's huge numbers of people that all of a sudden can afford to buy a house. And that means the demand for housing is going to go up. And that means the supply from the house builders are going to try to meet that demand by increasing the supply by building 2.5 million new homes. How many jobs does that create in the construction industry alone? Creates a lot of jobs. And when you create a lot of jobs, you are creating a lot of taxpayers, right? All those new construction jobs to meet this big demand for new houses, all of those carpenters and roofers and electricians, they're getting paid and they're paying taxes. So very, very good investments in terms of what's called return on investment. The baby boom, this is a demographic thing. I don't know if you've heard of the baby boom. Now we have all these terms for generations, millennials, Gen X, Gen Z, all that stuff. And the baby boom was kind of the first modern example of that. So it refers to the fact that there's an explosion in the birth rate starting literally 9 months after World War II ended. Do the math there. Um, and so the largest generation of Americans was born in this very compressed period here after the end of the war. And as they grow up to be teenagers and young adults in the late 50s, early 60s, it changes the economy, the consumer part of the economy, because the country was so rich that for the first time in history, we have young people with disposable income, or at least their parents have disposable income. So for the first time in history, there is a country, ours, that is so rich that big parts of the economy are geared towards things for teenagers rather than necessities for adults. And so advertising, right? Advertising goes after the potential buyer, right? They're trying to entice someone to spend money. And usually in the past, advertising would have been aimed at adults because adults are the ones with money. But now during this period, advertising and culture in general is aimed at kids and teenagers, trying to convince them to go bother their parents to give them money to buy this thing. And we saw that shift in all manner of things, TV shows, toys, movies, music, comic books. These are not essentials. These are not things people would have been spending money on during the Great Depression or World War II. But now that those two crises are over, there's so much money in the economy that there's extra money floating around for entertainment and toys, non-essential things, fun stuff aimed towards younger people. And so the culture changed radically in that regard. So this is Elvis Presley. Everyone's heard of Elvis. And there's something that changes in the culture here in terms of music. We referenced music earlier in the context of the age of urbanization. And during this period here after World War II, music starts to become very big business, and people are getting very wealthy from music. And 40 years later, 50 years later, Eminem had a song where he's kind of parodying. See, this is Elvis from Jailhouse Rock, and you see Eminem's in the same getup here. So he's kind of doing a parody of Elvis, and he's pointing something out that there's a lot of truth to in this lyric here. Eminem is referring to the fact that Elvis Presley got wealthy. He did. Uh, by using black music. So, to go back to the first time we talked about music in this course, pop music, popular music in this country, whether it's rock and roll, rap, whatever it is, has historically and still has historically been dominated disproportionately by black artists. That was certainly true in the 1950s. What was different between then and now is that the black artists were not profiting from their art the way they would now. Okay. Now we have a situation where, you know, Kanye West is a billionaire. That would not be a thing in the 50s, all right? And not just because of inflation, but because the industry was rigged in a way that now it's not. So the artists weren't getting rich and famous usually. Now Elvis was an exception. Elvis did get rich and famous. I just want to point something out here about um, what Eminem is saying in this lyric. There's certainly some truth to it that a lot of the music Elvis performed was written by black artists, and the writers of those songs did not get anywhere near the profit share that Elvis got, or that the white record company owners got, or the radio station owners got. That's true, to be sure. I do want to point out Elvis was a once in a 100 year, once in a century talent. You know, he wasn't just, you know, lucky and stumbled into great songs written by black artists. And, you know, he was a generational talent, undeniably talented artist. But the point remains, if he were black, he would not have been the cultural icon that he was. No way. Not during this period of American history. So that doesn't change yet, right? Music, big business in the 50s and 60s, just as it is now. But the artists profiting from their art the way they do now was not the case back then. The phrase under God was inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance and put onto our currency, coins and paper currency, in God we trust. And that was kind of rhetoric at the height of the Cold War to point out the distinction, the difference between our system and the communist worlds. And we mentioned this briefly earlier in the course, that communism is fundamentally an atheistic worldview. The communists are very open about that. And the United States, what you may disagree with this, which is fine, obviously, but historically, and especially during this period, there was an understanding from most Americans that this is a Judeo-Christian nation in terms of the ideas that it was founded upon. If you are not religious, that's fine. Obviously, that's great. We have a First Amendment, which, you know, means the government can't do anything to you, whether you're religious or not. Um, Even if you're an atheist, which many Americans are, you really cannot truly understand the foundation and the ideas upon which this country is founded without understanding Judeo-Christian values. That doesn't mean you need to be a religious person to be a quote good American, but it means even if you reject religious ideas, Judeo-Christian ideas are at the centerpiece, at the center of most of the founding principles of our society. And so during the Cold War, a lot of people felt the need to kind of stress that. Now, in terms of the First Amendment, separation of church and state is kind of the shorthand for what people refer to. It doesn't say that in the Constitution, but that's fine. A lot of people didn't like this on constitutional grounds. Say, wait a minute, the government is not supposed to be promoting any religion. So why are we putting religious language on government printed currency? Right? A lot of people had a problem with that just philosophically. So interesting debate, constant debate back and forth in this country. What does separation of church and state mean? Does putting in God we trust on our money violate that separation? A lot of people would say, yes, it does. What's referred to as the homophile movement began in the 1950s. Um, This is at a period when same-sex sexual relations were illegal in every state. And I want to be precise about that language so you understand, because this issue has changed incredibly quickly, even during your lifetime. So I want to make sure you understand what this is saying. So this is the early kind of prototype of the gay rights movement and later the LGBTQ movement. This is kind of the first version of it, the homophile movement. And during this period, same-sex sexual relations were illegal in every state. So not not same-sex marriage was illegal, although of course it was. Same-sex marriage would not have been something anyone was talking about as even a possibility during this period. Would have never come up. Okay. They're not saying same-sex marriage was illegal. Obviously it was everywhere. They're saying same-sex sexual relations was illegal. The physical act of, following through with your same-sex attraction. All right, I'm trying to keep it PG, but you understand what I'm saying. The physical act was illegal. Where? And people might have stereo, oh, probably Mississippi. Well, yeah, in every state, in every state, not just the states that you might characterize or, caricature as bigoted, every state, it was a criminal offense to be gay. I'm pointing that out so that you understand and appreciate how incredibly quickly this has changed. 60 years later, that sounds like a long time for young people and even for me, but historically speaking, that's boom, that's quick, right? 60 years later, we go from it's illegal to be gay in every state to same-sex marriage, not just same-sex relationships, same-sex marriage is legal and protected in every state. Incredibly swift progress from a historical perspective. I want to point out one thing about this photograph where you have these people protesting um, out in public. I want you to understand that at the time, the consensus in the society at large on the issue of homosexuality, the consensus from most people was, number one, most people during this period from a religious point of view would have said that it's a sin to be homosexual. And number two, from a more secular social science perspective, the medical establishment, medical doctors, psychiatrists, the entire medical establishment classified homosexuality as a mental illness. And so the people in this protest here, if any of them, for example, were teachers and they were identified as being at this protest, they'd be fired because the consensus would have been homosexuals are mentally ill by definition. The consensus was that they are more likely to be predatory towards children. And this is all in medical journals. This was not some fringe theory. And therefore, they can't be teachers. So these people in this protest, they're risking, in many cases, their physical safety and or their careers. So that takes serious bravery. I think we can all agree. By 1960, 1/3 of Americans live in suburbs. That was kind of a new concept. We talked earlier about the era of urbanization. And during that period where we covered that, it was kind of you either live in a city or you live out in a rural area. A suburb is this kind of hybrid middle ground. And what makes suburbs possible is, well, a couple things. One, we just covered all of the new houses being built because of these new government programs. But number two, to live in a suburb where you might be 10 miles away from your job, maybe 30 miles away from your job, you're not going to walk to work 50 miles round trip every day. Suburbs are only possible in the American context if cars, privately owned cars, are widely available and affordable. So for the first time, there's this third option. You can live in a city, you can live out in the countryside, or you can live kind of in the middle in a suburb. But to do that, you need a car. The book points out that no federal law prohibited racial discrimination in housing until Congress passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So that is a law with very good intentions. We want to make it illegal to racially discriminate in housing. In other words, we want to make it illegal for banks and sellers to not sell houses to African Americans. That should be illegal, of course. Um, so great intention on that law. I will point out that even though that law has great intentions, it's very hard to enforce that because you're kind of you'd have to prove a negative. It's almost like a thought crime. How do you prove why someone didn't do something? If I'm selling my house and I have 5 families that want to buy my house, and one of the families is a black family, and 4 of the other families are white, and I sell my house to a white family, how can you prove that I didn't sell the house to the black family because they're black? How can you prove that in a court of law? That's very hard to prove. So it's a great intention, that law, but it didn't fix the problem. It made progress, but it didn't fully fix the problem of racial discrimination in housing. That's a lot harder to fix because you're talking about what's in people's minds and what's in their hearts and why they did or didn't do something. That's hard to prove to a legal standard. Now, as the subways or the suburbs rather start popping up all over the place, we also have new interstate highways. The federal highway system, Route 95 is the one you'd probably be most familiar with in our part of the country. Those are relatively new roads. And they rerouted traffic away from the old local road networks, the small towns. They bypassed well-traveled main roads, smaller state and county roads, and they cut wide swaths through old neighborhoods in the cities. So there's a couple things there. This is going to have a huge effect on American society in terms of how people travel, where they're spending money, um, what is going to happen to small local family-owned businesses. So we'll go through some examples of that in a minute. In terms of the new federal roads bypassing the older roads, this is creative destruction. The new federal roads are the creation. The destruction is all the businesses that used to be along those older roads. Now, not as much traffic is going by, and those businesses are going to suffer. The creation of the interstate highways, Route 95, for example, destroyed tens of thousands of family-owned businesses, restaurants, gas stations, hotels, and those were replaced with the businesses that we see along the side of Route 95, for example, and they're not small family-owned franchise businesses. They're big homogenous, McDonald's, Texaco, Holiday Inn, etc. So there's a couple things here. Um, this is creative destruction, right? This is a photograph from Route 66. That's one of the iconic older state roads that used to be traveled much more. So on the older roads, the state roads, you had tens of thousands of family-owned restaurants, one-off, unique, not big chains, not Burger King, but a family-owned, mom and pop's sandwich shop, whatever. And as these new roads become open, the big federal highways, so let's say you need to take a trip, you're driving 50 miles, and now you have 2 options. You can go on the old state road, which is probably 1 lane in each direction, and the speed limit's probably 40 miles an hour. Or you can go on the brand new federal highway, which is maybe 3 lanes in every direction, and the speed limit is 65 or 70. Which are you going to do? You're going to go on the newer, bigger road where you can drive faster and there's no stoplights because you're going to get to your destination quicker, obviously. So that's cool. You can drive from A to B more quickly. Great. What's the destruction part of that creation? You are no longer driving down that old state road, passing all of these family-owned restaurants, gas stations, and hotels. Now, if you need to eat and you're on Route 95, you're going to pop off an easy on, easy off exit and go to McDonald's. When you need to fill up your gas, you're not going to mom and pop's old-timey gas station that has been owned by that family for 3 generations. You're going to go to Texaco or Shell or Mobil, right? Some big international conglomerate. And if you need to stop and rest your head overnight, you're not going to go to a small local family-owned motel. You're going to go to Holiday Inn, for example. So what happened to all those jobs, all those businesses, those family-owned independent businesses? They were destroyed. Now, 2 things happened. First, economically, that means that all those people in those restaurants used to be self-employed. A family owned a restaurant, owned a gas station, owned a hotel. They worked for themselves. They weren't rich, but there's a lot of dignity in that, and they were better off because they owned their own business. So solid middle class, right? Now all their businesses were destroyed by these big international conglomerates that are along the big new highways. So where are those people going to go to work? They're no longer going to work for themselves. They might have to go get a job at McDonald's. They no longer own their own restaurants. Now they make minimum wage at McDonald's. They no longer own their own gas station. Now they make minimum wage at Texaco. They no longer own their own hotel. Now they're, you know, vacuuming the carpets at the Holiday Inn after you check out. So economically, people lost a lot of power. Individuals, right? Fewer people were working for themselves. More and more people are working for these big companies. That's an economic cost to some degree. And there's also a kind of almost a spiritual component to this. The country became less diverse. The number of independent, unique, one-off, you only find it in this one place, unique businesses went down, 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 down. And they were replaced by homogenous, they're the same everywhere, McDonald's, Texaco, Holiday Inn. The country became less diverse in terms of businesses, in terms of restaurants, in terms of hotels. I don't know if that matters to you philosophically, but a lot of people argue that, we lost this sense of uniqueness. When you drove across the country, physically, the landscape is, of course, very unique and diverse in all parts of the country. That can't change. But what did change is that the people, the culture, the businesses, the food, that diversity was lost to a large degree. When you drive across the country now, the number of unique family-owned restaurants that are going to cook you something you've never experienced before, that experience has never been harder to find in our country than it is now. And they've been replaced with McDonald's. A chicken nugget is a chicken nugget is a chicken nugget, whether you're in Alaska or Montana or Massachusetts. They're all the same. There's no diversity. And some people just kind of intellectually don't like that, right? They like the diversity, the spice of life, the unique nature of different parts of the country. That still exists, but much less so than before. I want to go back to one other thing they point out here because it connects with one of the last things we're going to cover here. The highways cut wide swaths through old neighborhoods in the cities. Let me give you an example. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island. I don't know if you're familiar with Providence, if you've ever driven through it even. Route 95, which was built during this period in the 1950s and 60s, cuts right through the center of Providence. What was there before that highway was built? It wasn't just a big strip of empty land. Providence is a very old city by American standards, goes back to the 1600s. There were neighborhoods there. And as the text points out, you got this is creative destruction again. You got to build a big new highway. Okay. Well, if it's going to run through the middle of a city, Providence, Rhode Island, for example, you're going to have to destroy some stuff before you can create that highway. You're going to have to tear down neighborhoods. And we are allowed to do that under our Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, what's called eminent domain. The government can seize your property and destroy it in order to build something. It has to meet two conditions. Number one, the thing they're building has to be for public use. It can't be a private business. The government can't tear down your house so that someone can build a Taco Bell there. It has to be for public use, and the highway is for public use, so that fits. And the government needs to pay you for your property. They need to pay you the value of your house before they tear it down. But as long as they do those two things, you can't, there's nothing you do. They're going to tear down your house. What neighborhood did they tear down? Well, in the case of Providence, Rhode Island, they didn't tear down the rich neighborhoods where all the fancy people live. They tore down the poor, mostly black neighborhood in South Providence, where I grew up. And that probably doesn't shock you. So certain areas of the cities were destroyed, creative destruction to make way for these highways. And the neighborhoods that were torn down were almost always the poor minority neighborhoods. In the 1950s, the nation's 12 largest cities, so we're probably talking LA, New York, Chicago, Detroit, a lot of the same ones that would be on the list now. Lots of people moving. They lost, the 12 largest city lost 3.6 million whites while gaining 4.5 million non-whites. So the numbers overall went up. So there's a lot going on here that I want you to look at critically. Sociologists usually refer to this as white flight. It's catchy, it rhymes, you can kind of tell what it is. White people are fleeing the cities. Okay, let's look at these numbers. 3.6 million whites left the cities. Now, obviously, white people were also moving into the cities, but when you look at both columns, white people coming in, white people leaving, overall, we have 3.6 million whites leaving the cities. And non-whites, some are moving into the cities, some are moving out of the cities, but overall, the trend is clear. The trend overall, on aggregate, the net trend is significant numbers of white Americans are leaving these major cities, and significant numbers of non-white Americans are moving into those cities. And sociologists refer to this as white flight. And the thesis behind white flight is that white people were leaving the cities because black people were moving in. White flight implies a not so subtle racism as the motivation for this. And it was that the motivation of a lot of these white Americans leaving the cities. Were they leaving because black folks were moving in? You'd have to ask them, and most of them are dead. I'm sure for a lot of them that was the motivation. Sure. What I would ask you to consider critically is that the only motivation? What else could have been going on here? Why else would people leave cities? Well, I just told you I grew up in Providence. I grew up in a city, and now I'm in a very different environment. I'm out in the middle of nowhere. I got chickens in my yard. I can tell you why I left the city. It had nothing to do with race. It had to do with crime, noise, pollution, and awful public school systems that I could not, in good conscience, send my children to. And I liked the peace and quiet. And I had the opportunity, through luck and hard work, to move out of the city because it didn't fit the lifestyle that I wanted. Nothing to do with race. Um, I'm sure for some people it was. For some people, it might have been different job opportunities. For some people, it might have been, I just got a GI loan. Now I can go out and live in the suburbs. There's many different reasons for this, but the fact remains the cities became less white during this period. And that is referred to in the sociology books as white flight. Now, that in turn leads to a very complex debate. So here's what happens to the cities, and it continues to this day. American cities used to be clean, beautiful places. During this period, people start leaving the cities for any number of reasons. Maybe it's racism, maybe it's lifestyle, maybe it's I just want to be able to touch grass. Whatever the motivations are, people are leaving the cities. Now, who is leaving the cities generally? People that can afford to. And so if people that make a good living who can afford to buy a house out in the suburbs, if they leave the city, you know what they take with them? Their tax dollars. If you leave the city and go buy a house in the suburb in a different local jurisdiction, you are now paying your property taxes in that suburb. And you're not paying any property tax in the city because you no longer live in the city. So what happens to the infrastructure of the city? What happens to the school system, which is paid for locally? What happens to the fire department and the police department, which is paid for locally? Well, there's fewer tax dollars in the cities now because more people with money are leaving for any number of reasons, and the cities start falling apart. The textbook says urban infrastructure stood underfunded. Yes, to this day in our country, our public school system in the cities is an unmitigated disaster. It is a tragedy of epic proportions. It's an embarrassment to this country. And this is where it starts. Housing and job discrimination were compounded, made worse, by the frenzy of urban renewal that hit Black neighborhoods. And so this is what we'll end with. Really complex issue for you to think about, and you can do a current event on this if you find this interesting, because this is still an issue today. Gentrification is the term sociologists use for describing this process in which people with money come into a poor, rundown neighborhood and invest money to clean it up, make it safer, more beautiful, more appealing. Okay? So, the frenzy of urban renewal that hit Black neighborhoods. Here's the paradox. Look at this before and after picture. Let's say there is a neighborhood in New York City, and let's say it's mostly African American, and it is run down. The buildings are in bad shape. Um, let's just talk about the buildings, like the physical reality of living in that neighborhood. The buildings are crumbling. We don't want that for our citizens. We should not accept that in this country. It's the richest country in the world. Every American should have a standard of living that we should all be proud of. So we don't want our inner cities to be collapsing, obviously. We don't want that. Nobody does. So what do? Well, we should fix them up, right? That's a great idea. What could go wrong? Well, here's the paradox. Look at this before and after picture as an example of gentrification. Let's say it's a poor, mostly Black neighborhood on the left. And let's say a bunch of rich, well-meaning in their minds, mostly white people invest a bunch of money to making that rundown neighborhood beautiful. Isn't that great? Well, yeah, but what do you think happens to the rent in this building, in this example, the before and after? What's going to happen to the rent? You understand what's going to happen to the rent. The rent's going to go way up because the people that spent all this money to improve this city They need to get that money back. They didn't do it out of charity. How are they going to get a return on their investment? The rent in the after picture is going to be much higher than the rent in the before picture. So if the developer says, I'm improving this neighborhood because I love the people that live here and I want to make their neighborhood more beautiful, that sounds like a great motivation. And the reality, unfortunately, is that maybe you have pure motives, but what you just did on a practical level is made it impossible for the people you claimed to be helping to afford to stay in their homes. You follow that? So you see the paradox, though? We don't want to leave neighborhoods run down in terrible condition. But if we fix them up, we might make them too expensive for the people that live there to even stay in their homes. And we don't want that either, right? So what do we do? What do we do? It's an incredibly complex issue. And we can see that at play now in inner cities all over the country. And all of these complications with the inner cities collapsing, mostly due to lack of enough tax revenue. And we can trace that back to people who made good money leaving the inner cities for whatever reason, racism, other reasons, whatever it is. That reality started during this period and continues being very much an issue to this day. All right, so that does it for this unit, and I will see you next time.